Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Joining me now, James North, reporter covering the Global South, editor-at-large at MondoWeiss. James, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
So let's, a broad stroke on this. Let's just remind people of the recent history in terms of Venezuela, because that you had a piece in The Nation assessing what happened during the election to some extent, but also prescriptive for the United States based upon what we've done in the past. And a conversation, I would imagine, I'm also just in general, you're reporting, but you were speaking to James Weisbrot. So give us that sort of like a quick history of where we are with Venezuela.
Well, thank you very much. It's a complicated story, and I really was trying to do two things in this article in The Nation. I was expressing skepticism about the declared results of the election last week, but far more importantly, in my view, is the fact that no matter what happened in that election, whether the Maduro government is stealing it or not, I think they are, but that's secondary to my larger point, which is that U.S. economic warfare, which really increased enormously under the Trump administration, has created the greatest humanitarian crisis in Latin American history, certainly for the last 150, 200 years, which in turn has created the greatest refugee flow, again, in Latin American history. 1 out of every 4 Venezuelans has left the country. Some of them are arriving here. Most of them are still elsewhere in Latin America, but they may continue to head in our direction. And the U.S. economic warfare was declared by Trump. It was really a surprise to the experts in the U.S. State Department. The view is that Trump and Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, were pandering to the right-wing elements in the Latino community there. And so what they basically did, I just want to read what the consequences of this were. Let me just give you a few statistics here.
Please.
Mark Weisbrot he pointed out that since Trump declared this, the economic warfare basically closed Venezuela off from international finance. It blocked its exports of oil. It interfered with its imports because you need finance to finance imports. And as a result, Venezuela was already in an economic crisis. But I call it economic warfare rather than sanctions. What it did was Venezuela's economy collapsed by 38% in the first few years following Trump's sanctions, which is a greater collapse than happened in our country, in the U.S., in the Great Depression in the early 1930s. Imports dropped 91%, food imports by 78%. Malnourishment, which had been 3% a decade ago, rose to 27%. Infant mortality rose, and 82% of the population ended up in poverty. So my point is, whatever the intention behind these sanctions, all they've done is create misery and death for large numbers of Venezuelans and force others into exile. So no matter what happened in the election, and I do have an opinion about what happened, the U.S. should stop that, end the economic warfare, and then we can see what the next steps should be. But it really is a dramatic. In other words, let me just summarize by saying focusing on the election is obvious and important, and should be done. But the larger problem here is, again, the greatest humanitarian catastrophe in Latin America's history, certainly in the last 150 or 200 years.
I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize, although there is a tendency within the sort of like, I guess, the conventional wisdom of both U.S. foreign policy, and I think just like an average American, when we see something that we think is, unjust or ostensibly unjust, or, there's some type of civil war, our immediate reaction is we should get involved. But there are instances, Syria for one comes to mind for me, where we just can't do anything. We can't do anything. We can't do anything that is in any way helpful for the people that ostensibly we're going to help. Now, I also want to be, I'm not naive. there's a lot of people who have an interest in imposing these type of sanctions or to getting involved in these foreign conflicts who have a completely different agenda that has nothing to do with the people who live there as much as the resources that they want access to.
Correct.
They want cheaper oil. They want more expensive oil. They want to extract certain things. They want U.S. businesses to have whatever those agendas are. I'm talking about the one, I guess, that is sold ultimately to the American public, which is what we've seen time and time again in the context of Venezuela.
Oh, absolutely right. And U.S. hostility to the Chavez government and now the Maduro government dates back to when Chavez was first elected in the late 1990s. I spent some time down there in the early years of his reign, and there was certainly hostility. But what I want to emphasize here is that what the Trump administration did was an enormous escalation of the existing hostility and U.S. Criticism of what was going on there. It was under the Obama administration there was nothing equivalent. And what has happened is that although the Venezuelan economy was already in trouble in 2017 due partly to its own mismanagement and application, poor economic policies, but what's happened since then is that it's fallen off a cliff. And my dispute or questioning of the journalists who were there in person over the past week was, yes, they concentrated on what was actually happening in the streets, the allegations, in my view, true, of fraud on the part of the government, of stealing the election, all true. But what they should have done is maybe stay a little longer and gone into some of these poorer neighborhoods and done some reporting on the actual malnutrition that exists there, on how many people have left individual families. Apparently, in some of the demonstrations after the election results were announced, one of the things they said was, my father left, my grandmother left, my sister left, no one's left here. I mean, imagine that. A quarter of the country's people have left. Now, I have done a lot of work over the years in Central America. I reported during the U.S. war, supported wars back there in the 1980s. My first report was actually from Nicaragua in 1975 when the Sandinistas were just getting started. Okay, so it is certainly true that refugees, migrants, whatever term you want to use, have left, places like Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador in large numbers. But it's nothing like what we're seeing from Venezuela. I mean, in New York, where I live, I gather the latest figures are that 20,000 Venezuelans have shown up here in the last year or two. We never had refugees. We in the U.S., had very few refugees from Venezuela before. There were a few in South Florida, but that was about it. And so here's this disaster that's happening that's directly attributable in large measure to U.S. policy. And all the U.S. would have to do is end this economic warfare, end the sanctions. I gather the state, certainly it doesn't have to pass Congress. The State Department, the president could just do that. And I hope they would, because not only is it bad for Venezuelans in Venezuela, but if you're talking about the root causes being behind the massive wave of migrants heading north, this is one that is clear, obvious, recent, and can be remedied like with a stroke of a pen, frankly.
I mean, this is like first order, as opposed to, like, let's say Honduras, maybe, which is a legacy of U.S. involvement, which ultimately, undercut the civil society and the institutions that needed to be built and would have developed over time. This is first order, as opposed to sort of like, the delayed kidney punch, I guess.
Absolutely.
Let's just talk.
Right.
Okay. Let's because I want to actually give an assessment too of what Maduro is doing, just for fairness, because it is, but it's also like, to be able to sit with this idea of, like, Maduro may be doing some very bad things, might have done but that we're not in a position to be a positive influence. I want to talk about, but what has Biden done in terms of the Trump regime of economic warfare? I actually, there's been a good series in the Washington Post over the past couple of weeks about this.
Yes.
But has Biden rolled back any of it from the Trump regime to what extent has he, and what is still extant?
That's an excellent question. My main source for the economic facts in my article basically said that yes, the Biden administration has somewhat relaxed the sanctions, but that they're still crippling. The idea was that if you relax them somewhat, the government would carry out fair elections, then you would relax them some more. I question the morality of that, but I understand where they were coming from. But my point is that if Maduro gets away with this, you should still relax the sanctions because it's an economic, it's basically a disaster, helping to create or worsen a disaster. On top of which, one of my sources in the past has been Chuo Torrealba, who is a leader of the internal opposition. And the point that he has made is that, actually, let me just grab his quote right here from you so I can get it straight. His point is basically that, here we go. Okay. The Trump administration, here's what he told me a couple of years ago. The Trump administration believed that if you make people suffer, if you impose the politics of pain, that you will promote a general insurrection. That has not happened. Hungry people do not revolt. So in other words, the idea which would be that these sanctions would cause the Venezuelans to rise up en masse and overthrow the government failed. It failed. It almost always fails if you look at historical. I'm sure you could come up with a number of examples yourself.
Well, I mean, Cuba.
But the point is, exactly, precisely, it has failed here. So,
and not only that, I would argue, not only does it inhibit the type of reaction from the people that supposedly it's supposed to promote, it allows the leadership of the country to create a villain outside of the country's borders and blame everything internally on that outside. And I mean, look, Bush did it with the war on terror. Castro did it with the United States. It empowers these people time and time again. What really we're watching is really just a fight for people who want to prevent the nationalization of a country's resources. And they don't care about what happens to the people if they can sort of maintain their iron grip on that. Now, with that said, you make the point that in terms of the election, the Maduro government made no effort to get the vote of a quarter of the country's population who have left the country in the wake of these sanctions. Yesterday, I guess it was yesterday, the Maduro government basically announced a criminal investigation against the opposition presidential candidate Gonzalez. And his party's leader, Machado. They have arrested 2,000 opponents who have been rallying at the very least. And they're refusing to show precinct level vote counts.
Correct.
Let's and there's other I guess like Venezuelan based human rights organizations that are issuing reports saying that there's just a huge uptick in sort of like random arrests and whatnot. Give me your sense of Lula and Boric, president of Brazil and Chile, respectively. They both initially sort of came out in support of Maduro, but seem to be now taking a half step back.
Well, yeah, no, what you point out is quite accurate about the actual fraud and the repression. Another significant fact is the Carter Center, which is a respected human rights group, in the past has announced that Venezuela's elections were among the freest in the world. They had electronic vote tabulating, whatever, and that was true. That was true. That Chavez won all of his elections basically freely and fairly. I mean, there may have been some little chicanery on the sides here and there, but he was definitely a popular leader. All you had to do was be there during the time he was in, especially the earlier years. But at any rate, what happened was that for this election, the Venezuelan government did not allow many human rights groups in, but they welcomed the Carter Center because they figured that the Carter Center was going to endorse what they were doing, because it had in the past. And when the Carter Center announced that the elections were not free and fair, now the government has remained silent and is busy rounding up and locking up people. Behind the scenes, I think, although I have no inside information, but I think that there's certain maneuvering going on among the Latin American leaders of various types. Possibly there's negotiations behind the scenes with the Venezuelan military and whatever. And there may be some kind of transition, although, again, I have no firsthand information about this. But what I do approve of and like is that instead of the U.S. Butting its nose in here after having helped to create the problem, that, local leaders of, some are more conservative, some are less conservative, are starting to speak out, because it is a Latin American problem. The refugee, Ecuador has a lot of refugees from Venezuela. Colombia has millions. And as you pointed out, the government made no effort, the Maduro government made no effort to allow these people to vote, even though they were in exile. Sometimes that's possible. Certain countries certain citizens can vote in the US if they're actually citizens of Ecuador or Mexico or what have you. So that further cut the improve the chances of the government, because if you've been forced to leave the country because you don't have enough to eat, you're unlikely to vote for the government that's in power at the time.
You're unlikely supportive, right?
Exactly. Now, my beef with the U.S. State Department at the moment is that they came out, they announced, they criticized the election, and I think they said they were recognizing the guy who probably did, in fact, win. I wish they would just shut up. They've talked, they've stuck their nose in too often and with too many negative consequences. I understand they feel compelled that they have to say something, but why don't they just sit back, let let people within Venezuela and the local presidents from other, as you said, Lula, Boric in Chile, next door in Colombia, let them try and come with some kind of an arrangement here, which will hopefully be peaceful. Because if it's not, and if the sanctions continue, instead of losing a quarter of its population, Venezuela could lose half of its population. And a lot of them are going to show up on the Rio Grande in the United States eventually.
I think it's also, I don't anticipate this happening, but it would be a great opportunity for the leadership of this country to explain the dynamic, which drives immigration so often, is a function of people being, it's not the pull of the United States as much as the push of people not being able to live in their country, feed their kids, live safely, et cetera, et cetera. James North, really appreciate your time today. We'll put a link to your piece in The Nation magazine.
Yes, thank you very much.
And thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.